Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. We're here for our weekly Q&A session, monk chat session, and I see there's already a few questions. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then we'll start taking questions, and when we run out of questions, we'll end the session. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami.
Okay. So Tillman has a question. It says, how does one develop faith, for example, in rebirth? Is the psychological process similar to how one develops faith in, say, the resurrection of Jesus? Put differently, how does one come to believe in something that one doesn't know for one's own experience? I'm asking because last week you told me that Buddhists have faith in causality.
Well, I can't comment on the thing about faith in the resurrection of Jesus because I am, in fact, not Christian. So I don't have a whole lot of faith in the various doctrinal aspects of Christianity, so I'm not the best person to talk about it. That would be an interesting question to ask, say, a Catholic monk. You can ask them what their relationship to faith in the resurrection of Jesus is. But as I personally am a Buddhist monk, I can't comment on it. But as for faith in things like rebirth and causality, well, it's sometimes said that there's two bases for faith. One is through direct experience, and the other is inference based on direct experience. And both need to be handled a little bit carefully because, of course, it's quite easy to convince ourselves to believe whatever we already want to believe. So the first thing of direct experience, for example, you mentioned causality. Well, you can actually observe causality in your direct experience all the time. So you're constantly making choices on the assumption, the faith, that it will bring corresponding results. And you make choices and you get corresponding results, and that reinforces your faith in causality. And that then leads you to make further choices, which you believe will bring corresponding results, and you observe that those too also bring corresponding results, and so on. Simple examples are when you're thirsty, you tend to believe that drinking water will alleviate your thirst. That's an article of faith right there. You have faith that drinking water will alleviate thirst. Case in point. This man has a lot of faith, apparently.
It worked, yeah.
It did. It worked. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Temporarily.
So we're doing this constantly. And we're constantly, therefore, observing and reinforcing our belief in causality. So then through that direct experience of causality, then one can infer the principle of causality to things which are outside of our direct experience. So, for example, I have not personally killed anyone, but I can infer, based on my observations of causality, that killing people would be a really bad idea, and that it would have very harmful consequences in my life. So I'm not going to do it. Because I have enough faith in causality through direct experience that I can infer causality applying to things outside of my direct experience. And so then this applies also to things like rebirth. Rebirth, in fact, is a natural inference from our observation of causality in daily life. Rebirth is just saying that causality works on larger scales than the day-to-day that we observe. That causality extends unseeably into the past and also unseeably into the future. That causality is a universal constant principle that extends indefinitely in both time directions. So again, this is something which It's difficult to directly confirm through personal experience, causality extending indefinitely into the past and future. But we can observe causality operating with a remarkable degree of consistency in our daily life, our direct experience. And from that, we can infer its likely functioning on larger scales as well. Okay? Good. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Actually, I do, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think I agree with Bante in terms of commenting, on the details of the Christian. I'm definitely not qualified per se. So you're trying to, Teddy's here. But I would say that just at least on a surface level, I would say to address your question in terms of a low-level familiarity level, so don't take this as obviously a Christian opinion, but I think that I would say the process in Buddhism is a little bit different from the resurrection of Jesus for at least most Christians in the world, as Bante explained. So you can't actually infer the resurrection of Jesus is essentially its faith in a historical event. So if you look at Christian debates on the topic, it's important that this historical event happened, right? If it didn't happen in history, it's a specific thing that they say happened, then it loses faith in that. So it's faith in that a historical event took place. But in the suttas, in the Buddhist discourses, faith is different. So the Buddha actually says, for example, he says to a group of people, actually several different people in different occasions, not to rely on scriptural tradition, not to rely on logical inference and rational philosophical investigation through reasoning and so on, and a series of other things. He says not to rely on those, but he says instead to preserve truth. So how you know something, you should preserve truth. You should be honest with yourself about how you know it. And then he also says to know, as Bante mentioned, for example, in direct experience, whether you have greed, hatred, or delusion in your mind. And if those are not in your mind, you know that directly. So the point is, the Buddha kind of says, well, this is something that you can know. And this is for people who were doubting. They had a similar question to you. So they were doubting, who do we believe? How do we know this? And usually the Buddha's answer to those types of questions for faith and, say, rebirth, what he said was, well, you can know in your own mind if there are wholesome or unwholesome qualities. You can know that for yourself. Like if you're greedy, hater, if you're angry, and if you act unskillfully out of those things, like if you break the precepts, again, as Bante mentioned with, say, killing, for example, if you did that, then you can know if you do that or not, and then you can know, okay, that would have bad consequences for me. Because in the present, those mind states are uncomfortable, and we know they're uncomfortable for other people. And so the Buddha said that, inferring from that, what he gave was, he said, it's like a safe throw. Like if you're throwing dice, you have a good hand, you know that it's always a good throw. That if you are skillful have wholesome mind states in this life, you're going to be comfortable, people will like you, it's going to be nice for you, and then you won't have anything to fear anyway. Like let's say that there is rebirth, well, you don't need to be afraid because you're doing good things, you're being a good person. So if there is ethical rebirth, you don't need to be concerned. If there isn't, well, at least you had a good life this time. So that's one way that the Buddha talks about it. Of course, you can't really do that with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Maybe other people would say you could, maybe you have a meditation experience or something, but just on the surface level, there's a difference between a historical event and laws, principles of the mind that are operating at every moment. And so this is something that the Buddha said, he calls it Dhamma Niyamata or Dhamma Titita. So it means a natural principle or a law that is naturally standing. And then the other thing about direct experience that I wanted to just contribute to this is that there is a sutta where the Buddha distinguishes two types of knowledge that someone who attains stream entry gains. So it says that a stream enterer has the direct knowledge. In order for a stream enterer to become a stream enterer, they must understand rebirth, not in the same level of recollecting past lives, but they have to understand the principle of the mind of how craving leads to rebirth, and so they will know that. But then also they will have what's called anvayinyanang. Anvayinyanang is sometimes translated knowledge of entailment or inferential knowledge. And so the Buddha says that the stream enterer, they understand basically how rebirth works, how it happens, on terms of the level of their mind, not in terms of the specific details of their memories. And then they infer from that, in the past and the future, it is also the same. So it's different from what the Buddha calls Dhammayana. So he calls Dhammayana, knowledge of the principle, is they know in the present how the mind operates. And that's true at all times. So it's true at all times, whether it's past or future. But then they infer, in the past, those same principles applied, and in the future, those same principles will apply, which they don't actually observe directly, because we don't actually observe the past and the future directly. But it's kind of like if you observe gravity, then you infer that it was the same in the past, and in the future also this law will apply. So that's what the Buddha says. He says that first they understand the principle, and then they infer that that same principle is true in the past and the future. And so this is why the Buddha says in another sutta, for example, that someone who attains stream entry, they know that samsara has no discoverable beginning. They don't know that by recollecting it through the details of their past lives, per se. They might, but if they have that ability. But they know it because they understand the principle of how, based off of conditions, then they understand that defilements give rise to rebirth, which provide new conditions, where defilements give rise to rebirth. So by understanding that principle, then they infer into the past and future. So there's that principle of causality, which there's the level of someone who has experience and then someone who how they infer from that experience. And both of those are talked about in the suttas. So if you're interested, I recommend you read, I think it's called the Jnanavatta Sutta. And there's maybe a couple where it comes up, but there's a couple that actually discuss the level of inference and knowledge for people about the issue of rebirth.
Okay.
Okay, Richard says, how can I let go of the past if I have to learn from my mistakes? And how can I let go of the future if I have to look forward to not break any precept?
Well, learning from your mistakes, once you've learned, then you let go of the past. So you can recall the past as, again, information to learn from, as you mentioned. But one way of letting go of it is to not identify as the person in those stories. So what we call memories are actually stories about some person who did something. The actual accuracy of our memories is questionable. But even if our memories are accurate, they're just stories about somebody who did some stuff and what happened to them as a result. So you can relate to these memories as stories, like fables or fairy tales or parables, moral stories with a moral principle that you can learn. But don't take them personally. Don't think, I did this, I did that, that was me. Instead, just relate to them as third-person stories, which have something important to learn. Then you'll notice that already the mind doesn't get so wrapped up and caught up in them. And it's also good to remember that you can't do anything about the past anyway. So once you've learned the lesson, then that's the end of the story, and you move on. As for the future, well, you don't need to worry about breaking any precepts in the future because it's impossible to break precepts in the future. You can only break precepts in the present. So as long as you cultivate clear awareness of your choices and motivations in the present moment, then you will never break any precepts. So if you want to guard the future, all you have to do is guard the present. Because when the future comes, then it will no longer be the future, it will be the present. It's only ever the present. And you only ever make actions in the present, and therefore it's only ever possible to break precepts in the present. So you don't need to worry about the future at all. You only need to guard the present. Okay?
And Cal's our friend.
It's a good name.
Says, Anguttara Nikaya 4.41 talks about meditation on light for concentration leading to knowledge and vision, but doesn't go into detail. Could you talk about what knowledge or vision is meant here, and how knowledge and vision is meant here, and how this is done?
Yeah, so the meditation on light, aloka sanya, the perception of light, it's mentioned in a few places in the suttas. It's not particularly common. So the main meditation practices that the Buddha talks about are mindfulness of the body, which includes mindfulness of breathing, loving kindness meditation, and to a lesser extent the other three Brahmaviharas, and the recognition of the three characteristics of anicca, the non-persistence of phenomena, dukkha, the unsatisfactory nature of experiences, and anatta, the impersonal or non-self nature of things. So these are the main meditation practices that the Buddha talks about. And then there's a handful of others which he speaks about much more rarely and not in much detail. So the perception of light is mentioned in a few places in the suttas, but the Buddha doesn't give a lot of detail. The one that I remember is he says, perceive the night as the day and then day as the night. So constantly filling the mind with radiance as though it's always daytime, as though it's always bright, full of light. And in a few places in the suttas, that's recommended as something to counteract drowsiness or mental dullness. As for it leading to knowledge and vision, I don't actually think there's a direct correlation, but rather through cultivating the perception of light, then again, this is visualizing or imagining bright light in the mind, is that this is a way of cultivating concentration, a way of cultivating samadhi. So breaking the 5 hindrances, cultivating samadhi, and then with samadhi as a basis, then one is able to directly perceive anicca, dukkha, anatta. And it's that direct perception of anicca, dukkha, anatta that leads to knowledge and vision, rather than necessarily light itself. And this is important because in a few places where perception of light is mentioned, it seems to not be something that in and of itself leads to awakening. But rather is just something which can lead to a high rebirth, but without the cultivation of further wisdom practices, it's not sufficient for full awakening, at least as far as I can recall. Do you recall anything else on the topic?
Well, the one thing that comes to mind with me is it's a little bit speculative, is that in this sutta, the Samadhi Bhavana Sutta, I interpreted the Jnana Dasana there as referring to the divine eye, seeing other beings. Because there's one sutta where the Buddha talks about how he saw other beings through, he had light in his mind, and as the light extended, he could see other deities. So the way I always interpreted that is that their Jnana Dasana refers to like a lower level, like not in terms of the normal one, but like a vision of other beings or something. But that's how I interpret it, at least. That's what makes. But
that seems reasonable. Yeah.
Anyway, it's still not necessarily applicable for most people.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, and Jason says, what is the significance of the number 108?
In early Buddhism, none. It has no significance at all.
Are there 108 feelings, Svante?
What's that?
Or is it something else, 130?
I mean, there's a way to arrive at the number 108 because it's divisible by 3. So I've heard various Theravada monks try to find some way to justify the number 108 within the scope of the early Buddhist sutras, but it always comes off sounding kind of weird and forced. So as far as I can tell, the number 108 having some mystical significance is a completely Mahayana phenomenon. It doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with early Buddhism. Okay? Unless you've come across something else? Didn't think so.
I don't think so. I just the only thing I thought of was I thought there was maybe one list of 108 feelings, but that's not mystical or anything.
36 times 3.
So
that's one way you can get to it.
Okay, yeah. It's not mystical, or it's not really.
No. It's just math. I mean, if there's one thing early Buddhism does do, it's a lot of math.
Do you know what is the significance of the number in Mahayana, Bhante?
I mean, again, there's a million different explanations. So I think it's just one of those numbers that, again, it's easily divisible. So different people arrived at it in different ways.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. And Kim says, I've been meditating for several years, but instead of noticing or being aware of the breath, I find myself forcing it in and out. How can I change this to awareness?
Well, Kim, what I recommend is to stop doing mindfulness of breathing. Do literally anything else for a while. And if you do want to do mindfulness of the body, then be mindful of everything except your breathing. Be mindful of your body, your whole body, except for breathing. So if you're having this problem of forcing your breath in and out whenever you focus on your breathing, well then just don't focus on your breathing. Okay, next question.
Okay.
It's this bizarre obsession with mindfulness of breathing.
The Buddha called it the Tathagata's Vihara. So.
Yeah, I mean, he also taught many other kinds of meditation.
Okay. And May says, for a while now I have difficulty meditating because after perhaps 10 minutes, when I'm about to go deeper, my body jerks and sometimes sways back and forth. It's like my body is resisting going deeper. Okay, so
I mean, realistically, 10 minutes, you're just getting started. Sit for an hour, And what you'll usually find is that, yeah, I mean, maybe after 10 minutes your body jerks a bit, and then after a few more minutes it settles back into stillness. And then a few minutes later you might get agitated again, and then you'll get peaceful again. So yeah, I mean, just keep going. Sit for longer periods of time. Don't worry about like involuntary body movements. Just focus on letting go of all voluntary movements. Don't engage in any voluntary or intentional body movements. Just keep cultivating the meditation practice. And the body will tend to settle into deeper serenity on its own in time. Okay.
Okay, Julie says, good evening. Good evening, Julie. Says, I'm wondering how the word love is defined in Buddhism or in the Buddhist teachings. Is love a concept? Does the experience of love necessarily involve grasping and clinging, or not necessarily?
Well, the word love is not defined in Buddhism because the word love is an English word, and the early Buddhist teachings were not written in English. So the early Buddhist teachings are preserved in Pali. Those are the oldest ones we have anyway. Actually, I guess technically the Gandhari ones might be older.
That's true, yeah. The Gandhari ones are technically older.
Yeah, but it's a Prakrit dialect, which is pretty similar to Pali, so it kind of amounts to more or less the same. Anyway, so the word love doesn't actually appear in the early Buddhist texts because the early Buddhist texts are not in English. So then what we wind up doing is we wind up taking words which are in the Pali Suttas and defining those words and seeing which one has some similarity to the English word love. And the word metta, for example, is sometimes translated as love. But it needs to be understood that the word metta has a distinct set of denotations and connotations which overlap with some of the denotations and connotations of the English word love, but not all. So it's a little bit risky to then assume that every single connotation of the English word love applies to the word metta. In fact, it's not the case. Much of it does apply, some of it does not apply. So as a translation, it's okay, but it needs to be understood that metta is a distinct concept from the English word love. There's overlap between the two concepts, but not 100% overlap. So metta is, the simplest definition is metta is the emotional or mental state of universal benevolence. The mind state or emotional condition of wanting everyone to be happy without exception. And so then it does not necessarily involve grasping. In fact, ideally one is cultivating metta without grasping, without clinging, without attachment. But just with this pure, boundless benevolence, this limitless, all-embracing benevolence. Okay?
And maybe Bante, I just mentioned that there's also, obviously, normal love is also mentioned in the suttas, and that is with clinging. The Buddha also talks about how your loved ones bring you suffering.
Oh yeah.
So that also does come up as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different word. That's pia.
Yeah.
The word pia, which also is sometimes translated love or affection. And yeah, I mean, there's a delightful discourse called the Pia Jatika Sutta, in which the Buddha quite clearly says suffering arises from love.
Yeah.
If we choose to translate pia as love.
There's actually a really nice story. I can tell. There's one where King Pasenadi is like, he's talking to his Queen Malika, and he says, "Oh, Queen Malika, who do you love most in the whole world?" And you can just imagine he's smirking, and she says, "Myself." And the Buddha says, "Yep, that's how it is. That's how it is. The person we love most in the world is ourselves." And then there's other places where someone hears from the Buddha, I think it's the Pijatika Sutta, that the Buddha says our loved ones cause us suffering. And they're like, yeah, I don't know about that. And they go to there's a bunch of gamblers nearby. And the gamblers are like, no, our loved ones cause happiness. And they're like, yeah, the gamblers are right. So the sutta is clearly setting up a narrative here where it's like uninformed opinion.
Good times.
Okay, Manny looks like he had a question, but I don't see the first part of it. He says this casts doubt. So, Manny, we don't see your whole question. If you want to type that in. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
And Mark says, do I hear a cat purring?
And that's quite possible because right now Teddy, the monastery cat, is sandwiched between the two of us and he's very happy. So you might hear him purring from time to time.
He may have some suffering when this deer scenario fades. Okay. And Ulysses says, can a layperson become enlightened? Should I seek Buddhahood?
So one important thing that I want to point out is that there are no such thing as lay people. There are people who are laying, who are producing the actions and behaviors and comportment of lay life. That doesn't mean you are a lay person. It means that lay person is something you are currently doing. And you don't have to keep doing that. You could choose to do something else. Because every now and then people are like, oh, the monks are discriminating against lay people, blah, blah, blah. No, we're not. We're discriminating against unwholesome behaviors rooted in desire and attachment. That's what we're doing. So if you stop doing those things, then you will make much swifter progress towards enlightenment, and you will probably also stop being a lay person. So can a lay person become enlightened? Well, it depends on what you mean by lay person. So in the suttas, there are a couple isolated cases of somebody who was not a monk attaining full awakening. The interesting thing about these cases is that person immediately tried to become a monk. Immediately. They immediately recognized that lay life was fundamentally incompatible with enlightenment. That lay life necessarily involves engaging in unenlightened behaviors, and therefore is fundamentally incompatible with the enlightened mind. So, the moment these people who previously had been acting like lay people, the moment that they attained awakening, they immediately tried to stop being lay people. And, of course, the vast majority of people who attain enlightenment are not lay people. They're monks of some kind, living a monastic life. And this is because enlightenment, awakening, in the Buddhist sense, is ultimately a function of renunciation. So it's technically not a function of meditation. Awakening is a function of renunciation. It's the result of renunciation. And the Buddhist path is a path of renunciation. And monastic life is a life of renunciation. So usually, the closer somebody gets to awakening, the more likely they are to renounce lay life and become a monastic. So for this reason, the vast majority of people who attain awakening have already become monastics by the time they attain awakening, and usually long before. So then to answer your second question, should you seek Buddhahood? You should definitely seek awakening. I wouldn't be too specific about the exact form. So whether to be an Arhat or a Pacceka Buddha or a Sammasambuddha, it's kind of irrelevant. I would just aim for attaining full awakening. I wouldn't be too specific about the exact form.
Seems like not so many people are aspiring for Pacceka Buddhahood though now.
I have in my life met one or two people who had that specific vow, and they were clearly doing it just to be different, which means it was a function of self-centeredness and arrogance, which means they're not getting any awakening of any sort anytime soon.
Okay. And Sud says, Dear Bhante, if one practices diligently without deterrence, can he or she consider themselves making a lot of merit for themselves and others? What does it mean to include those practicing towards stream entry, but not gain the fruit of stream entry in Supatipanno Bhagavato Savaka Sangho, Supatipanno Bhagavato... Oh, so in the verses. Looks like two separate questions, I guess. So, yeah, so...
Okay.
Yeah, first one... If one practices diligently without deterrence, can they consider themselves making a lot of merit for themselves and others?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
And then what is the meaning of those practicing towards, like those who are the eight individuals, the ones who are on the path but not attain the fruit?
So one important thing to understand is that the recollection of the Sangha is the recollection of the monastic Sangha. And therefore the 8 people on the path, the 8 stages of the path that are mentioned there is monastics who have those 8 stages of the path. So, yeah, that includes monastics who are on the path to stream entry, all the way up to monastics who are arhats. So that's all included. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And Julie says, I appreciate your answers, Sadhu. And Luis says, if all conditions are sunyata, how can they be anicca, dukkha, and anatta?
Well, actually, the fact that they are anicca, dukkha, and anatta is why they are sunyata. And the fact that they are sunyata indicates that they are anicca, dukkha, and anatta. The way that sunyata is defined in both Theravada and Mahayana texts is inseparable from anicca and anatta. In the Pali text, this is actually quite explicitly stated that they are sunya, that is empty, because they are anicca and anatta. This is what makes them empty. They're empty of self. They're empty of anything belonging to a self. In the Mahayana text, they tend to emphasize a bit more the anicca side. They are empty in the sense that they are empty of persistent existence. So that's emphasizing the anicca characteristic. But both Theravada and Mahayana texts both directly correlate the anicca and anatta characteristics with the sunya characteristic. So all these things work together. So things are empty of what? They're empty of persistence, and they're empty of self. Therefore, they are anicca and anatta. So anicca, anatta, and sunya fit together perfectly. They're basically just 3 different words for the same thing. They're perfectly interlocking concepts. And dukkha then follows from this. So why are things dukkha? Well, they're dukkha because we are constantly seeking persistence and reliability in that which is impersistent and unreliable. We're constantly seeking self-identity, personhood, in that which is non-self and impersonal. So that's what makes these things dukkha. Okay? Anything else on that?
I think that's good. Okay. I mean, I was wondering if maybe their question is coming from a slightly different place, but because I know sometimes they'll say like, because something's empty, it doesn't arise, it doesn't cease, so it's not impermanent, it's not permanent. But that's a little bit of a different topic, I guess.
Well, maybe if Louis, if this didn't answer your question, you can ask a follow-up.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to start hypothesizing wrong views to then attack, or else we'll be here literally all night. There's no end. So people misunderstanding the Heart Sutra has been going on since the Heart Sutra was composed 1,500 years ago.
In China.
So actually, it's an extract from the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, which then was summarized, and a little short opening blurb was added.
I think the mantra there too, right?
And the mantra was added at the end. But the actual core doctrinal segment of the Heart Sutra is literally copy-pasted from the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra. And in fact, that's why it's called the Heart of Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra.
Yeah.
That's literally what it's called, because that's literally what it is.
Yeah.
Years ago, I actually tracked down the Sanskrit text that was the basis for the Heart Sutra, and it's almost identical. It's slightly longer, and it's actually tragic that they left out certain things when they shortened it into the Heart Sutra, because there's a few interesting tidbits that they should have left in. Anyway, but that's a side point. Okay. Go ahead.
Polka here says, I think you mentioned that the Buddha did more than one type of meditation. What types of meditation did he do?
You can answer this.
Okay, well, the Buddha, I would say he probably practiced many forms of meditation that he taught. The main ones that he mentions he mentions mindfulness of breathing. So there's a sutta where he does a retreat and he goes and he practices mindfulness of breathing. When he comes back, he says, monks, if anyone asks you what I was doing, you should say that he was practicing mindfulness of breathing. He was developing samadhi based off mindfulness of breathing. And then he says things like the mindfulness of breathing is the Tathagata Vihara, so the meditation or the abiding of the Tathagata, of the Buddha. And so definitely he practiced that one. And then also he obviously practiced the jhanas and the arupa samapatis, the formless attainments. Though those don't really count per se as meditation techniques. Those are more results that someone might get if they practice meditation properly. But he definitely practiced those. So he said that, for example, if someone were following the footsteps of an elephant, and eventually they find the elephant and so on, or they find the footsteps. One time the Buddha said that people following the gradual training, if they reach the jhanas, then they found the first footprint of the Tathagata. Like the Buddha was here if you were tracking him. Because someone who enters a jhana, they enter where the Buddha has been. So he definitely practiced those. And then he also practiced, very likely, I would say, the Brahma Viharas. I can't think of a place where he says specifically that he did, but I would say it's pretty much implied.
There's definitely a place where he says he does it. I'd have to track it down, but I remember there being a couple places where he says that he did.
Okay. And then, interestingly, I don't actually think, although the Buddha teaches Asubha meditation and things like body contemplation, cemetery contemplations, I'm not aware of any place where he actually says that he did that on the path to awakening. He recommends it to other people. So maybe he did. Could have also been a common practice that many meditators did at the time. But I can't think of a place off the top of my head where he specifically says that he developed that practice. But he did teach it. And then he did other meditations as well. Like he did, there's one really interesting meditation where he tells the monks that he was meditating on how the different factors of the path are conditioned and how, like, it sounds very trippy, but it's in the section in the Samyutta Nikaya on the Eightfold Path, so you can find that there. He talks about this weird, some meditation he was doing on the conditioned nature of the path. And if you're interested, there's also the book by Bhante and Alio called something, and it's specifically about, it's called A Meditator's Life of the Buddha. And it's a biography he put together of the Buddha's life in terms of the meditations he practiced, and then it has like guided meditation instructions in each section. So there he collected like different passages where the Buddha specifically talks about the meditations he practiced. So
Okay.
So it says, how can one strengthen one's hiri and ottappa as mentioned by the Buddha? Thank you for your Dhammadana.
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is to recollect the harmful consequences of evil deeds. So there's a number of places in the suttas where the Buddha talks about the karmic consequences of evil actions. One of my favorites for this is the Chulakama Vibhanga Sutta, the lesser discourse on the analysis of karma, in which the Buddha gives some very straightforward examples. If you hurt other people, then in future lives you'll have more physical afflictions and illnesses. So apparently I wasn't very nice in my past life, since I have some chronic health problems. If you kill other people, then you'll tend to have a short lifespan. If you're harsh and nasty and cruel to other people, then you'll tend to be ugly. If you're stingy, then in future lives you'll be poor. So he gives a number of clear examples like this. So you can use that to cultivate your hiri and ottappa when you reflect on the harmful consequences of evil deeds. You can also reflect on the fact that these things are blamed by the wise. These things are criticized and condemned by the wise. So that also means that we should try to avoid them. Like if all the great wise spiritual people in the world think that these actions are harmful and best avoided, well, maybe they have a point. Maybe we should trust that. Another great one that the Buddha recommends is whenever doing anything, you should remember there are monks and priests and devas who can read people's minds. What if they were watching my mind right now? What would they think? And then that might inspire you to be like, okay, well, I want to cultivate a beautiful and spiritually praiseworthy mind. So that if I am being spied upon by telepathic entities, that they'll be pleased and satisfied rather than disgusted. So that's also a tool for cultivating hiri and ottappa. And another useful one, of course, is just recollecting the incredibly long and painful cycle of samsara, which we're going to continue to be stuck in if we don't cultivate this bloody spiritual path. You can think about billions and billions of lifetimes spent in misery that you've already done, and you're going to do it again if you don't straighten out your mind this time around. So that might also help cultivate some hiri and ottappa. Okay?
And Mark asks, so what in the suttas happens when one awakes? Since last week you referred to consciousness and awareness and coming and going. Oh, as coming and going. Oh, he's asking, so what happens? Okay.
Well, I mean, the Buddha doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on the actual moment of awakening. He mostly talks about the path, how to get there. But one thing that is clear is that in the moment of awakening, there's the clear recognition that absolutely nothing whatsoever is me or mine. And in that moment, all suffering permanently evaporates. And all delusion immediately disappears. Okay, next question.
Anna Maria says, happy to see you. Hope you're well, Anna Maria. If we don't fully identify with the mind anymore, are we still responsible for our choices? aka creating more karma, aka rebirth cycle continues. Also, what is Orthodox Buddhism?
Okay, so there's at least two different questions here. If we don't fully identify with the mind, are we still responsible for our choices, aka creating more karma? Yes, of course you're responsible for your choices, because they're going to happen to you. So you might say, oh, I don't identify with my choices. Well, then when the negative consequences happen, you can say, oh, I don't identify with these negative consequences, and see how much that helps you. So you could try, I don't actually recommend doing this, but you could try, for example, so make a fist, look at it and be like, I don't identify with this fist, and then punch yourself in the face a few times and think, I don't identify with this face either. And then I don't identify with the pain in the face. And see how well you can convince yourself. And at some point you will realize that you're just fooling yourself. You are in fact making choices, and you are in fact experiencing consequences, and the consequences are in fact painful. And realistically, you're not going to actually do this because you already know. You already know that there are consequences to your choices. So realistically, you're not going to start punching yourself in the face and trying to convince yourself that you're not responsible for your karma, because you know that you're responsible for your karma. As for your question, what is Orthodox Buddhism? Of course, depending on someone's tradition, they'll answer this in different ways. If you ask me, then I will say Orthodox Buddhism is those teachings as described in the early suttas, which is a concise, self-consistent, and direct path to awakening. Okay, next question.
Okay, I'm not sure. Is this a question? Doesn't look
Not
like it is.
really. It's more like a string of buzzwords.
Okay, it doesn't look like it's a question.
Okay.
So it says that he recently broke his precept to not drink alcohol, and I drank. Seeing this danger in my life, I decided to avoid alcohol. It is so great that monks have apostate days. What options does one have in lay life to straighten out one's path in life so that one doesn't deter away from his own well-being in terms of Dhamma?
Well, so actually, the Buddha says when one has done something wrong, then the proper thing to do is to go to one's spiritual teacher or to a respected spiritual companion and confess. Confess what you did wrong and vow to restrain yourself in the future. So you've done that, you did something wrong, and then you acknowledge to yourself, oh, I did something wrong, and I want to stop doing this. And now you've told a couple of monks that you did something wrong and you want to stop doing it. So you're actually on the right path already.
Sadhu.
Sadhu, yeah. So just make that clear resolve in your mind, recognizing that drinking alcohol is literally the opposite of Buddhist practice. Right? It's cultivating qualities which are the exact opposite of the factors of awakening. And it's something which might seem like a good idea at the time, but the actual consequences are to just make you even more delusional, even more confused. It just makes you even more unrestrained and even more lost in the cycle of suffering. So you recognize you made a mistake, and now you've confessed it, and now vow to be restrained in the future. So yeah, the Uposatha days are good, but the Uposatha days are days for stepping up your daily practice. Your daily practice is to follow the 5 precepts. And I would add on top of that, also to do a little bit of sutta study, a little bit of chanting, and a little bit of meditation every day. It can be just a few minutes of each. But these are the basic Swiss Army knife of Buddhist practice. If you want to keep progressing in your practice, follow the 5 precepts. That's absolutely critical. Follow the 5 precepts at all times. And every day, read a little bit of the suttas, do a little bit of chanting, do a little bit of meditation. And in this way, you'll keep making progress over time. Okay?
Okay, and Kanchana Deshapriya says, Venerable Sir, could you please explain regarding the papancha?
Yeah, so papancha is mental complication or the engaging in internal storytelling. So we have an experience, and then based on that experience, we start weaving a story in our mind. We start telling ourselves a story about the experience. That's papancha. And the tendency is for this story to become increasingly complicated and elaborate. And this tends to happen very quickly, and we tend to believe it. So our actual experience might be something very simple and harmless, but then we start weaving a complex story around it. An example of this from many, many years ago, when we had just run a retreat, and after the retreat, one of the retreat managers noticed that one of the sets of bed sheets was missing. And immediately, they started weaving a story in their mind of like, oh, it's that one lady, she must have stolen it. I had my eye on her from the beginning. There was something off about her. I know for sure they stole it. I'm going to write them an email telling them that they need to return the bed sheets that they stole. And then they fire off this hostile email to the person saying like, oh, you need to bring back those bed sheets. We don't have enough. They're not free. And then it turns out that the bed sheets had just been put on the wrong shelf. They had never left the retreat center. They were still in the retreat center. They'd just been stored in the wrong place, which is why we couldn't find them. So this is an example of papancha. There was a sensory perception, seeing the empty shelf. Where the bed sheet was supposed to be, instead you see an empty shelf. So the actual sensory experience was just seeing an empty shelf. But then the mind spins a whole story of like, oh, the bed sheets are missing. Oh, the bed sheets must have been stolen. Oh, the bed sheets must have been stolen by that one person. Oh, now that one person is left with the bed sheets and I need to write them an email telling them to bring... Like the mind generates this whole complicated story, which in this case, as is often the case, it wasn't even a true story. What was true was only the initial sensory impression that there was no bed sheet on the shelf. That was true. Everything after that was just a story that this person was telling to themselves and then convincing themselves to be true. So that's an example of papancha. So if you stay with clear awareness of just your sensory perceptions, then you'll notice the moment that storytelling engine starts up in the mind, and you can stop it right away. Okay.
And Kausar Friend says, speaking of Uposatha, what Uposatha calendar does Empty Cloud follow? I also heard a recommendation for lay people to pick an easy day like Sunday instead. Thoughts?
So we go by the actual local moon days. If you just look up whatever the full moon and new moon is for New Jersey, then that's the calendar we follow. So we follow the local moon calendar. As for lay people picking an easy day like Sunday instead, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to make an Uposatha day for yourself, ideally it should be a day that's off from work. So it might be a little bit weird if you're like telling your boss like, okay, I need Tuesday off this week because it's the full moon, and I need to follow the 8 precepts and meditate. And then a couple of weeks later, you're like, okay, boss, I need Wednesday off because now it's the new moon, and I need to follow the 8 precepts and meditate. And you might get away with that a couple times, but then after a little while, your boss is going to be like, seriously, what the hell is wrong with you? So maybe if you have a really lenient boss or a very flexible work schedule, you can do that. But be realistic. Be realistic. The point of picking an Uposatha day, the point of having an Uposatha day is having a day when you can commit to your spiritual practice, following more precepts, doing more practice. It doesn't really matter whether or not it lines up with the full moon and new moon. The full moon and new moon is just a convenient way of keeping track of time when you're living in the forest. But these days, when most people's week is not based on the moon schedule, then it's not necessarily the most convenient way to set up your own practice schedule. Okay.
Okay. It looks like that's the last question online.
Okay. Well, in that case, we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.
Have a good week.